The scent of overcooked pot roast and stale tradition clung to the dining room like a shroud. My name is Sarah Miller, and for 15 years, my life had been a monument to my father's dream, built brick by brick with my own sweat and sacrifice. I'd transformed Miller Hardware from a single dusty corner shop into Miller & Son Industries, a thriving 5-store chain that was the gold standard for contractors across the state. I'd given it my youth, my weekends, my relationships. I'd negotiated million-dollar contracts on holidays and missed weddings to oversee inventory audits. I did it all with the quiet, unwavering belief that one day, the and Son, in the name would become a quaint historical footnote. Tonight was supposed to be that night. My father, Arthur Miller, was retiring. He sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, a place he occupied with the unthinking certainty of a king on his throne. His face, usually a roadmap of gruff determination, was softened by the dim lighting and the weight of his announcement. My mother, Eleanor, fluttered around him, her anxiety a palpable hum in the air. And my brother, Kevin, sat opposite me, fidgeting with his silverware, a man perpetually lost in the shadow of a life he never had to build for himself. He'd spent the last decade and a half drifting, a ghost funded by our father's indulgence, a failed brewery, a disastrous foray into day trading, a half-finished real estate course. Each failure was cushioned by a check from Dad, each disappointment smoothed over by Mom's gentle excuses. I felt the familiar coil of resentment in my gut, but I pushed it down. Tonight was about the future, about my future. As you all know, my father began, his voice resonating with practiced authority, I've decided it's time to hang up my tool belt. He paused for the expected gentle laughter. Miller & Son has been my life's work. I started it with nothing but a loan and a belief in good, honest service. Sarah, he said, and my heart leaped. You've been instrumental in its growth. Your strategies, your dedication, remarkable. I allowed myself a small, tight smile, the muscles in my face stiff from years of professional composure. This was it. The validation, the handover, the culmination of 60-hour weeks and sleepless nights. But a company of this size, he continued, turning his gaze away from me, it needs a firm hand at the tiller. It needs a clear line of succession. It needs a man's leadership to navigate the tough years ahead. Words hit me not like a sound, but like a physical impact, a sudden, brutal pressure in my chest that stole my breath. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. I could feel Kevin straighten in his chair, a flicker of something surprise, triumph, in his eyes. My mother's gaze dropped to her plate, her silence a familiar form of complicity. That's why, my father declared, his voice booming with a finality that echoed off the crystal glasses, I'm proud to announce that Kevin will be taking over as CEO. I am transferring 70% of the company's shares into his name, effective immediately. He beamed at his son, the useless son, the son who thought inventory management was something you did with a clipboard once a month. I felt the blood drain from my face. The room seemed to tilt, the faces around me blurring into a grotesque tableau of betrayal. 70%, not a partnership, not a joint leadership, a coronation. And Sarah, my father added, almost as an afterthought, his eyes finally finding mine again, a glint of what he probably thought was generosity in them. We've created a new position for you, Regional Manager of Operations. You'll be a great support for your brother as he gets his feet under him. Regional Manager, a glorified babysitter, a demotion wrapped in the insulting guise of a promotion. I was to report to Kevin. I was to support him. I was to hand him the keys to the kingdom I had built, and then teach him how to use them. A profound, chilling silence descended upon the table, broken only by the frantic, too loud scrape of Kevin's chair as he stood up to accept the applause that never came. In that moment, something within me fractured, and something else, something harder and colder, began to set in its place. I looked at my father's proud face, at my brother's dawning, undeserved confidence, and at my mother's averted eyes. They had not just underestimated me, they had erased me. I didn't say a word. I simply folded my napkin, placed it beside my untouched plate, and felt the first spark of a new, rival fire begin to burn. The following morning, I drove to the corporate headquarters of Miller & Son Industries, a sleek, 3-story building I had personally scouted, designed, and overseen the construction of 3 years prior. Every inch of it, from the polished concrete floors to the custom-built shelving in the executive offices, felt like a part of my own DNA. Now, it felt like a foreign country. IW. Alked past the reception desk, offering a tight professional nod to the staff, people I'd hired, mentored, and celebrated birthdays with. Their smiles were hesitant, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and confusion. The news had clearly traveled fast. My office, corner suite on the top floor with a panoramic view of the city, was exactly as I had left it. The framed industry awards on the wall felt like artifacts from another life. My desk was a landscape of my own making, neat stacks of financial projections, supplier contracts I had personally negotiated, and a half-finished marketing plan for the next quarter. I methodically began to pack my personal belongings into a single cardboard box. A photo of my parents and me at the opening of our third store, I tucked it face down. A small, carved wooden bird a grateful client had given me. A collection of fountain pens I favored for signing deals. Each item was a ghost. I didn't shed a tear. The grief from the night before had cooled and hardened into something more useful, resolve. The betrayal was no longer a wound, it was a blueprint. My father found me just as I was taping the box shut. He stood in the doorway, his large frame seeming to shrink in the space that was supposed to have been his legacy to me. He held a coffee mug that read "World's Best Boss," a gag gift I'd given him years ago. He looked tired, older than he had just last night. "Sarah, don't be rash," he started, his voice a low rumble. "This isn't a slight. It's about family, about the name, Miller and Son. It's always been the plan." I stopped taping and looked at him, really looked at him. I saw a man trapped by his own antiquated beliefs, a man who saw his daughter's competence as a support system, not a leadership quality. Was it the plan for me to increase profits by 300%? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Was it the plan for me to secure the exclusive distribution rights with Northgate Tools? Was it the plan for me to build this company into something you couldn't have imagined, only for you to hand it to someone who thinks a balance sheet is a piece of furniture? His face tightened. "Kevin is my son. He deserves his chance. He'll learn. You'll be there to guide him." The condescension was breathtaking. He still didn't see it. He saw me as a tool, a brilliant and effective one, but a tool nonetheless to be used for his son's benefit. I picked up the box. It was heavier than I expected. "I resign, Dad," I said, the word dad feeling foreign on my tongue. "Effective immediately." I walked towards the door. He stepped aside, a look of genuine shock finally breaking through his stubborn pride. "You can't just leave," he stammered. "There are projects, accounts, you have a non-compete clause, Sarah. 6 months, you signed it." I paused at the threshold and turned back to face him, a faint, humorless smile touching my lips. "I'm aware. 6 months is just enough time to plan." He didn't understand. He thought my life's work was the company. He was wrong. My life's work was my own potential, a resource he had just foolishly handed back to me, complete and untethered. As I walked through the bullpen, the silence was absolute. Every head was down, every employee suddenly fascinated by their computer screens. But I could feel their eyes on my back. I knew what they were thinking. They knew who had really run this company. And I knew that in 6 months I'd be calling on the best of them. The walk to my car was the longest of my life. With each step, I felt the weight of 15 years of loyalty sloughing off my shoulders, leaving behind a cold, invigorating lightness. I didn't look back. There was nothing left for me there. The kingdom was his. The war was about to be mine. The first week of my self-imposed exile was a study in silence. The phone, usually a screaming appendage of my body, lay dormant on my kitchen counter. The constant flood of emails had ceased. The rhythm of my life, once dictated by quarterly reports and supply chain logistics, was replaced by an unnerving void. For 15 years, my identity had been interwoven with Miller and Son. Without it, I felt like a ghost haunting my own tastefully minimalist apartment. My mother called every day. Her voice was a strained, thin thread of anxiety, attempting to weave our fractured family back together. "Your father is just traditional, Sarah. He didn't mean to hurt you," she'd plead. "Kevin is trying his best. He looks up to you." I listened, my responses clipped and noncommittal. Her attempts at peacemaking felt like salt in a gaping wound. She couldn't or wouldn't see the fundamental injustice of it all. To her, preserving the fragile peace of the family unit, no matter how dysfunctional, was paramount. The peace she was fighting for was built on the foundation of my subjugation, and I was done being the cornerstone. By the second week, the grief had fully receded, replaced by a cold, meticulous anger that I channeled into action. My spare bedroom became a war room. A large whiteboard covered one wall, quickly filling up with flowcharts, supplier names, and market analysis. The 6-month non-compete clause, intended to be a leash, became my shield. Behind it, I could plan my insurgency in absolute secrecy. I spent my days at the public library, diving into municipal zoning laws, commercial real estate listings, and the latest trends in retail design. I spent my nights building a business plan that was not just a competitor to Miller & Son, but its antithesis. Miller & Son was traditional, bulky, and slow to adapt. My company would be agile, tech-forward, and customer-centric. I named it Apex Hardware. The name was a promise and a threat. I knew every weakness in my father's company because I had spent years trying to fix them. He resisted my pushes for a modern point-of-sale system, a streamlined online presence, and a more robust loyalty program for contractors. He preferred handshakes and paper invoices. Kevin, I knew, would double down on that nostalgia, mistaking it for a brand identity. It was a fatal error. One evening, I received an unexpected call from Marcus Thorne, the head of logistics at Miller & Son. He was a wizard, a man who could get a pallet of roofing shingles across the country in a blizzard if he had to. He was also fiercely loyal, but his loyalty I had always known was to competence, not to a name on a building. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "It's a mess here." I remained silent, letting him talk. Kevin tried to renegotiate the freight rates with our primary carrier. He thought he could bully them. They just dropped us. "We're scrambling and our delivery schedules are a joke." He paused. "He doesn't listen, he thinks he knows everything." I felt a grim satisfaction. This was the first domino. "Marcus," I said, my voice even, "I can't discuss company business with you, you know that." Another pause, longer this time. "Right," he said, the understanding clear in his tone. "I was just calling to see how you were doing. I hope you land on your feet. A lot of us do." The message was clear. The best people were already disenfranchised. My army was waiting for its general. As the months wore on, similar calls and veiled emails came in. Alina, the top sales executive, hinted at major clients being neglected. David, the head of customer relations, spoke of plummeting satisfaction scores. They weren't just giving me intel, they were sending out distress signals. The 6 months of purgatory were not a period of waiting. It was a crucible, forging my resolve, sharpening my strategy, and confirming the deep, systemic rot that I had been holding at bay for years. On the final day of my non-compete, I stood before the whiteboard in my spare room. It was no longer a collection of ideas, it was a battle plan. I had a name, a business model, a list of prime locations, and a short list of key personnel to poach. I felt a pang of something complex, not guilt, but a somber recognition of the gravity of my next steps. I was about to declare war on my own family, but it was a war they had started. I was simply going to finish it. The day my non-compete clause expired felt like a new year, a birthday, and a parole hearing all rolled into one. The air itself seemed thinner, easier to breathe. My first official act as the founder of Apex Hardware was to walk into the downtown branch of a major commercial bank, the same bank Miller & Son had used for 30 years. I had an appointment with a senior loan officer named Mr. Harrison, a man I'd met at several Chamber of Commerce events. He was old school, a gatekeeper who prided himself on his shrewd judgment of character. He greeted me with a polite but skeptical smile, gesturing for me to sit in the stiff leather chair opposite his imposing oak desk. "Sarah," he began, steepling his fingers, "it's good to see you. I was sorry to hear you left your family's company. Your father is a good man." I nodded, accepting the veiled probe. "He is, but it was time for me to pursue my own vision." I slid a thick, professionally bound document across the desk. "This is that vision." For the next hour, I didn't speak of family or betrayal. I spoke of numbers, logistics, and market share. I walked him through my meticulously researched projections, my analysis of Miller & Son's vulnerabilities, and my strategy for capturing the lucrative professional contractor market they were beginning to alienate. I detailed my plan for a state-of-the-art inventory system that would reduce overhead, a responsive e-commerce platform, and a customer service model based on proactive partnership rather than reactive problem-solving. Harrison listened, his expression unreadable. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning profit and loss statements, cash flow projections, and marketing budgets. He was testing me, looking for emotional cracks, for any sign that It was a vanity project born of spite. I gave him none. "This is an aggressive plan, Sarah," he said finally, closing the binder. "You're proposing to go head-to-head with an established industry leader, your own family." "I'm proposing to fill a vacuum in the market that they are creating," I corrected him gently. "I didn't build Miller & Son's success by being timid. I know their playbook, their suppliers, their largest accounts, and their margins down to the last decimal point. This business plan isn't aggressive, it's inevitable." I leaned forward slightly. "And I know that their quarterly profits have dipped for the first time in 5 years. I'm sure your bank has noticed." His eyes flickered, a subtle tell. He knew. The numbers that crossed his desk told their own story. He was a banker first, a friend of my father's second. He saw the risk in backing me, but he also saw the greater risk in betting against me. He stood up and extended his hand. "I'll have my team review this, but I think we can make something work." The second step was finding a location. I didn't have to look far. A large retail space, recently vacated by a failed big-box electronics store, was available for lease. It was directly across the 4-lane road from Miller & Son's flagship store, their biggest earner and the symbol of their brand. It was a declaration of intent so blatant it couldn't be ignored. The lease agent raised an eyebrow when I told him the name of my company. "Apex Hardware, right across from Miller & Son, that's bold." "Bold is my brand," I replied, signing the papers. The following weeks were a blur of controlled chaos. Contractors swarmed the empty shell of the building, transforming it according to my precise specifications. I wanted an open, bright, and intuitive layout. Polished concrete floors, high-efficiency LED lighting, wide aisles, and a dedicated, comfortable lounge for contractors with coffee, Wi-Fi, and charging stations. It was everything I had pitched to my father and been denied. While the physical store took shape, I built my team. My first call was to Marcus Thorne. I met him for a discreet coffee far from the city center. He looked worn out, the spark of enthusiasm I remembered from our work together dulled by frustration. He didn't need much convincing. "Kevin second-guesses every decision I make," he sighed, stirring his coffee. "He thinks logistics is about finding the cheapest option, not the most reliable. We're losing credibility. When do I start?" Alina Cruz, the sales queen who could sell ice in a blizzard, was next. She was furious that her commission structure had been reevaluated by Kevin, who felt she was making too much. She jumped at my offer of a partnership stake. David Chen, the customer relations guru, was heartbroken by the declining standards of service he was forced to defend. He joined without hesitation. With my dream team secured and the loan approved, I watched the steel framing of the large Apex Hardware sign being hoisted into place above my storefront. From the parking lot, I could see the familiar, dated red and white sign of Miller & Son across the street. It looked smaller today, weaker. The foundation was laid. The first tremors were about to begin. The poaching of Marcus, Alina, and David sent a shockwave through Miller & Son Industries. It was not just the loss of 3 senior managers, it was the loss of the company's brain trust. Marcus was the logistical heart, Alina its sales-driven soul, and David its compassionate conscience. Their departure was a public vote of no confidence in Kevin's leadership. My father, I heard through the industry grapevine, was apoplectic. Kevin was reportedly telling anyone who would listen that I had betrayed the family and stolen his employees. The narrative was predictable, an attempt to frame my strategic business decisions as a petty, emotional outburst. It wouldn't work. The people who mattered, the clients, knew better. With my core team in place, we began the delicate and crucial work of flipping key accounts. I didn't make blanket calls. I started with a list of the top 20 clients, the ones responsible for nearly 60% of Miller & Son's annual revenue. I knew them all personally. I had negotiated their contracts, solved their emergency supply shortages at midnight, and attended their children's graduations. This was not business. It was a relationship I had cultivated for over a decade. My first call was to Bob Henderson, owner of Henderson Construction, the largest residential developer in the region. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man whose loyalty was to his project deadlines and his bottom line. "Sarah," he boomed over the phone, "heard you were back in the game. Takes guts to set up shop across the street from your old man." "It takes a good business plan, Bob," I replied smoothly, "and a commitment to service that I think has been missing from the market lately." "You can say that again," he gr. Humbled, My last order from Miller was 3 days late and missing half the specified fasteners. Kevin's new guy didn't seem to think it was a big deal. Cost me a day of labor. This was my opening. I didn't badmouth my brother or father. I didn't need to. I simply laid out the Apex value proposition. My logistics are run by Marcus Thorne, I said. He guarantees on-site delivery within a 2-hour window. My sales are handled by Alina Cruz, who is authorized to offer you a 10% discount on your first bulk order to welcome you as a foundational partner. And my customer relations are managed by David Chen, who will be your single point of contact for any and all issues. We have the new Northgate line you've been asking about, and our inventory is fully digitized. You can track your orders in real time from your phone. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him doing the math, weighing years of habit against the promise of efficiency and savings. "Send over the paperwork," he said finally. "You've got a deal." One by one, the dominoes fell. I repeated the process with the other major accounts. Some were hesitant, citing loyalty to my father. For them, I took a softer approach, inviting them to tour the new Apex facility, showing them the technology, and introducing them to the team they already knew and trusted. I never once mentioned revenge or family drama. My pitch was always about a superior business model. The message, however, was unmistakable. The competence they had relied on at Miller & Son had relocated across the street. The first shot had been fired, and it was a cannonball through the hull of their flagship. The financial bleeding at Miller & Son would be slow at first, a gradual erosion of their core business. But I knew their overheads. I knew the cost of operating 5 stores, one of which was now facing a direct, aggressive, and better-run competitor. Losing even a handful of their top accounts would be catastrophic. It was a war of attrition, and I had just captured their supply lines. I felt a cold, sharp thrill of victory, but it was tempered by a deep, resonant ache. Each call I made was a nail in the coffin of the business I had poured my life into. I was dismantling my own legacy to build a new one. It was necessary, it was just, but it was not without its cost. The grand opening of Apex Hardware was a meticulously orchestrated event. We scheduled it for a Saturday in early spring, the start of the busy construction season. The sun was bright, the air was crisp, and a sense of nervous excitement crackled among my new employees. A mix of poached talent and fresh hires I had handpicked for their energy and expertise. We had advertised heavily in trade publications and on local radio, but our most effective marketing was word of mouth. Contractors, lured by the promise of efficiency and better pricing, had been buzzing about our launch for weeks. By 8 a.m., an hour before we officially opened, the parking lot was already half full. A line of contractors in pickup trucks and work vans snaked from the entrance, coffee in hand, ready to see what the fuss was about. Inside, the store was immaculate. Sunlight streamed through the large front windows, glinting off rows of neatly organized tools and materials. The air smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. My team, clad in sharp, practical black uniforms with the sleek Apex logo, moved with purpose, making final checks and greeting early arrivals. I stood near the entrance, my heart pounding a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. I wore a tailored blazer and practical boots, an outfit that said I was in charge and I wasn't afraid to get my hands dirty. As the doors slid open at 9 a.m. sharp, the first wave of customers poured in. I saw familiar faces everywhere, men and women I had worked with for years, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and support. Bob Henderson was one of the first through the door, giving me a gruff nod and a thumbs up before heading straight for the contractor's desk where David was waiting. Sometime around noon, during the busiest surge, I glanced out the large plate glass windows of my office. Across the street, the Miller & Son parking lot looked quiet, almost desolate. I could see the familiar figure of my father standing near the entrance of his store, his arms crossed, watching the hive of activity at Apex. He looked smaller from this distance, a solitary figure guarding a fading empire. A moment later, Kevin's sports car, a flashy, impractical vehicle my father had bought him, screeched into their lot. He got out and joined my father, gesturing angrily in my direction. I couldn't hear their words, but I could read their body language. The shock, the denial, the dawning, terrifying realization that this was not a spiteful hobby. This was a hostile takeover executed with surgical precision. I felt a strange cocktail of emotions, a fierce, vindicating pride in what I had built, but also a deep, melancholic certainty that a bridge had not just been burned, but utterly annihilated. There was no going back from this. This public, undeniable success was a declaration that I did not need their name, their approval, or their legacy. I was building my own. Late in the afternoon, a small, elderly woman I didn't recognize approached me. She introduced herself as Martha, the wife of a small-time plumber who had been a customer of my father's since he first opened his doors. "I just wanted to say, dear," she said, her voice gentle, "that we're very happy for you. My husband says this place is organized just the way you used to try to get Miller's to be. It's a relief to be able to find things." Her simple words meant more to me than any of the large contracts I had landed. It was a confirmation that my vision wasn't just about profits. It was about respect, for the business, for the customers, and ultimately for myself. As the day wound down and the last customers departed, my team gathered in the center of the store. The exhaustion was evident on their faces, but it was overshadowed by a palpable sense of triumph. We had not just opened a store, we had made a statement. Marcus clapped me on the shoulder. "Well, boss," he said with a grin, "phase 1 is complete." I looked around at the bustling, successful space, at the loyal team I had assembled, and across the street at the dimming lights of my past. This wasn't just a new chapter, it was a whole new book, and I was the only author. 6 months after the grand opening of Apex Hardware, the industry landscape had fundamentally shifted. What began as a trickle of customers and accounts leaving Miller & Son had become a steady, gushing exodus. Our sales figures weren't just good. They were exceeding even my most optimistic projections. We were lean, we were hungry, and we were relentlessly efficient. Across the street, the opposite was true. The decline of my family's business was a slow, public unraveling. From my office window, I had a front row seat to the catastrophe. Their parking lot was consistently sparse. Delivery trucks, once a constant presence, were now a rare sight. They had been forced to reduce their operating hours, a clear sign of financial distress. I began hearing stories through the supplier network. Miller & Son was late on payments. They were arguing for discounts they hadn't earned. Kevin, it seemed, was trying to slash costs by squeezing his vendors, a classic mistake of a failing business. He was destroying decades of goodwill my father had painstakingly built. I saw it firsthand when one of our shared suppliers, a man named George who sold specialized lumber, came to me. "Sarah, I can't deal with your brother," he said, his face etched with frustration. "He wants 90-day terms and a 10% price cut. He's threatening to pull his business if I don't agree." His business isn't worth what it used to be. I had to drop them. I hired him as an exclusive supplier for Apex on the spot, signing a contract that guaranteed him fair prices and 30-day payments. The news of that exclusive deal rippled through the contractor community. Apex wasn't just the better-run store. It was now the only store with certain high-demand materials. The situation was best viewed through my brother's eyes. One afternoon, I saw him stalking through his own store, his posture rigid with anger. An employee was trying to talk to him, gesturing at a leaking pipe in the ceiling of the gardening section. Kevin wasn't listening. He was yelling, his voice a faint, angry buzz even from across the street. He pointed a finger in the employee's face before storming off. The employee, a man who had worked for my father for 20 years, simply shook his head and walked away. 2 days later, he was working for me. Kevin was a man drowning in a job he was never qualified for, and instead of learning to swim, he was blaming the water. The internal conflict at Miller & Son became a family affair. I received a tense, tearful call from my mother one Sunday evening. "Sarah, you have to stop this," she pleaded. "Your father and brother had a terrible fight. Kevin blames him for not preparing him, and your father, he's heartbroken. He says you've put a knife in his back. This business was his life." I felt a familiar pang of guilt, a conditioned response from a lifetime of being the family peacemaker. But I pushed it down, replacing it with the cold, hard clarity I had been forced to acquire. "I didn't do this, Mom," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "Dad did this when he chose legacy over competence. Kevin is doing this by running a good company into the ground. All I did was build a better one." "But it's destroying the family," she cried. "The family was already broken," I replied softly. "You just couldn't see the cracks until now." The conversation ended with her sobbing and me feeling emotionally drained but resolute. My father had made a choice set on outdated, sexist principles. He had bet on the wrong horse, and now the entire stable was burning down. I wasn't the arsonist. I was simply the beneficiary of a fire he had started himself. The downward spiral was accelerating, and as much as I tried to view it as a simple business equation, the human cost was becoming harder to ignore. I was winning, but the victory was measured in the slow, painful dismantling of my own history. The holiday season arrived with a cold snap and an even colder family dynamic. Thanksgiving was a minefield I had no intention of navigating. I politely declined my mother's strained invitation, citing an unavoidable inventory audit, a corporate-sounding excuse that was both plausible and blessedly impersonal. I spent the day with Marcus and his family, a warm, boisterous affair that felt more like home than my own home had in years. The forced separation, however, only postponed the inevitable confrontation. My mother insisted on a family dinner in the week leading up to Christmas. Her voice on the phone held a desperate, brittle edge that I couldn't refuse without feeling like a complete monster. "Please, Sarah, for me, just one night of peace." I agreed, knowing peace was the last thing on the menu. I walked into my parents' house, the same house I grew up in, and was immediately hit by a wall of oppressive tension. The scent of pine needles and roasting turkey couldn't mask the acrid undertones of resentment. My father was in his armchair by the fire, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his face a grim mask. He nodded curtly at me, not even bothering to stand. Kevin was there with his latest girlfriend, a young woman who looked deeply uncomfortable, as if she'd wandered into the middle of a play whose script she hadn't read. He shot me a look of pure venom before turning away. My mother fluttered between us, her smiles stretched so thin they were transparent. Dinner was an excruciating affair. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by the clinking of cutlery and my mother's increasingly frantic attempts to find neutral territory. She talked about the weather, a neighbor's new puppy, a TV show. Kevin made pointed remarks about loyalty and how some people would sell out their own family for a quick buck. I ignored him, refusing to take the bait. The dam finally broke over dessert. My mother brought out a pumpkin pie, her hands trembling slightly as she set it on the table. "Well," my father said, his voice thick with alcohol and bitterness, staring directly at me, "I hope you're proud of yourself, tearing down 30 years of my life's work, humiliating your own brother." The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I placed my fork down gently. "I didn't tear anything down, Dad," I said, my voice low and steady, forcing myself to meet his glare. "I built something new. You're the one who decided my 15 years of work meant less than Kevin's last name. It's a family business," he roared, slamming his fist on the table, making the dishes jump. "It was meant for my son. And what was I?" I shot back, the control I'd maintained for months finally starting to fray. "The interim manager, the placeholder until the real heir was ready. I gave you everything. I sacrificed my personal life for that company. I made you millions. And you dismissed me in front of the whole family because you believe a woman isn't capable of leading." My mother started to cry softly. "Please, not tonight." Kevin, emboldened by my father's anger, sneered from across the table. "You're just bitter because Dad saw you for what you are, a ruthless, ambitious shark. You never cared about the family, only the power." That was it. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "You want to talk about ruthless?" I said, my gaze locking onto Kevin. "Ruthless is taking a profitable, respected company and driving it into the ground in less than a year through sheer incompetence. Ruthless is blaming everyone but yourself for your own failures. I'm not the shark here, Kevin. I'm the competition you never saw coming because you were too busy admiring your own reflection." I turned to my father. "You made your choice. You chose tradition over success. You chose him over me. Live with it." I walked out without another word, leaving the wreckage of our family dinner behind me. As I drove home through the cold, dark streets, the festive Christmas lights of other homes seemed to mock me. I had won the business war, but the collateral damage was a chasm in the center of my own life. For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept in. Was the price of my justice too high? The thought was a bitter pill, one I forced myself to swallow as I drove further and further away from the ruins of my past. The year that followed was a relentless grind, a testament to the brutal realities of a competitive market. Apex Hardware didn't just survive, it thrived. We opened a second location in a Neeg, boring city, leveraging our sterling reputation with contractors to secure a foothold almost overnight. Our online business exploded, capturing a segment of the market Miller and Son had completely ignored. We were featured in a national trade magazine, an article that lauded our innovative business model and customer-centric approach. I was named Entrepreneur of the Year by the local business association. Each success was a validation, another brick in the fortress of my new identity. But each victory also felt like another shovelful of dirt on the grave of my family's legacy. Across the street, the decline of Miller and Son was no longer a spiral, it was a free fall. They had to close 2 of their 5 stores, the ones in more competitive suburbs. The news was a quiet shock in the community. Miller and Son had been an institution. Now it was a cautionary tale. Kevin, in a move of pure desperation, tried to fight back, but his tactics were clumsy and transparent. He launched a price war, slashing prices on major items to a point that I knew was unsustainable. He was selling products at or below cost, hoping to lure back customers with cheap deals. I refused to engage. Instead, I doubled down on our strengths. I ran workshops for our customers on new building techniques. I enhanced our loyalty program, offering even better rewards for our most frequent clients. I invested in training for my staff, ensuring they were the most knowledgeable in the industry. Customers might go across the street for a cheap drill, but they came to Apex for expertise, reliability, and service. The price war was a catastrophic failure for Kevin. He hemorrhaged money for 3 months before quietly raising his prices again, but the damage was done. He had cheapened his brand and alienated the few loyal customers he had left, who now saw him as unreliable. He even attempted a half-baked smear campaign, spreading rumors through suppliers that Apex was using inferior products. It backfired spectacularly when I released our supplier certifications and quality guarantees publicly, a move that only enhanced our reputation for transparency. His efforts made him look not like a savvy businessman, but like a cornered animal, lashing out blindly. My father, I heard, had all but disappeared from the business. He no longer came into the store. He was a ghost in his own company, a silent, defeated king who had handed his crown to a fool. The financial reports I managed to glimpse through industry contacts told a grim story. Their debt was mounting, their credit lines were shrinking, and their inventory was a mess of unpopular, low-margin products. They were drowning. I had built a better business, a smarter business. Justice had been served. The market had corrected my father's grievous error in judgment. Yet the victory felt increasingly hollow. I was succeeding, but I was doing it alone. My life was my work. My team was my surrogate family. I had proven my point, proven it so decisively that there was nothing left of the opposing argument but rubble. And in that rubble was my father's pride, my brother's future, and any lingering hope of reconciliation. The silence from my family was absolute. My mother had stopped calling. It was as if the Miller family, the one I had been born into, had ceased to exist, and I was left standing alone in the quiet, sterile empire I had built in its place. There are moments in life that act as a mirror, forcing you to confront a reflection of yourself you've been avoiding. For me, that moment came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office, reviewing quarterly earnings reports, a set of numbers so robust they should have filled me with unadulterated pride. Instead, I felt a familiar, nagging emptiness. My gaze drifted to the window, to the perpetually rain-streaked facade of Miller and Son Hardware. A moving truck was parked out front. 2 men were loading unsold inventory and office furniture into the back. They were closing another store. This wasn't just a rumor. This was the physical evidence of their collapse. I watched as an old, familiar figure came out of the store. It was Frank, a warehouse manager who had worked for my father for over 30 years. He had taught me how to drive a forklift when I was a teenager. He had always greeted me with a warm smile and a terrible joke. Now he stood on the sidewalk, his shoulders slumped in defeat, watching as the remnants of his career were hauled away like scrap. Our eyes met from across the divided highway. He saw me in my sleek, modern office, a queen in her glass castle. I saw him, a casualty in a war he had no part in. He gave me a slow, sad shake of his head before turning and walking away. That look, more than any angry word from my father or sneer from my brother, pierced through my armor of righteous indignation. Frank had a family, a mortgage. He was just one of the dozens of employees whose livelihoods were collateral damage in my quest for my victory was built on their loss. Later that evening, unable to shake the image of Frank's defeated face, I found myself driving through my old neighborhood. On a whim, I pulled up across the street from my parents' house. The lights were on in the living room. Through the window, I could see the silhouette of my father sitting in his armchair. He wasn't reading or watching television. He was just sitting there, alone, in the dark. The powerful, imposing figure I had known my whole life was gone, replaced by a diminished old man, haunted by the consequences of his own prejudice. For the first time, I felt a profound wave of something akin to pity. He had been wrong, deeply and fundamentally wrong. But his mistake had cost him everything he had ever built. In that moment, the narrative I had constructed for myself, the one where I was the avenging hero, began to crumble at the edges. The world wasn't that simple. This wasn't a story with a clear villain and a triumphant protagonist. It was a tragedy, with flawed characters making terrible choices that led to devastating outcomes for everyone involved. I sat in my car for a long time, the rain drumming a somber rhythm on the roof. I had achieved everything I set out to do. I had proven my worth, built a successful company, and established my independence. But as I looked at the quiet, lonely house across the street, I had to ask myself the question I had been avoiding for over a year. What had it all cost? The answer was sitting right there in the window, a solitary shadow in a darkened room. The cost was family, and I was beginning to fear I had overpaid. The call came on a Monday morning, just as I was heading into our weekly leadership meeting. The caller ID simply read Eleanor Miller, my mother. My heart gave a small, painful lurch. We hadn't spoken in nearly 8 months, a silence that had stretched from an awkward impasse into a vast, unbridgeable chasm. I let it go to voicemail, my hand unsteady as I placed the phone on the conference table. But a minute later, it rang again. This time, I knew I had to answer. I stepped out into the hallway, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the quiet space. "Hello, Mom," I said, my voice more fragile than I intended. Her voice, when it came, was stripped of all its usual warmth. It was thin and reedy, the sound of utter defeat. "Sarah," she began, her words catching in her throat. Your father needs to talk to you. Both of them, they want to come to your office." The request was so stunning, so contrary to every angry word and resentful silence of the past 2 years that I was momentarily speechless. My father and Kevin coming to me, to my office, the seat of my power, the symbol of their failure. The implication was enormous. This wasn't a social call, this was a surrender. "When?" I managed to ask, my mind racing. "Whenever you can see them," she replied, a note of pleading entering her voice. "Today, if possible, it's important." I thought of my packed schedule, the back-to-back meetings and deadlines. And then I thought of the moving truck outside their store, of my father's silhouette in the window. "Tell them 3 p.m., I said. "I'll clear my schedule." The rest of the morning passed in a blur. I went through the motions of my meetings, my mind elsewhere. I tried to prepare myself for what was coming, to game out the conversation, to fortify my emotional defenses. Would they come in anger, making one last, desperate stand? They come with blame, with accusations? Or would they come with a white flag, tattered and stained? I told Alina, Marcus, and David what was happening. They were my war council, the ones who had been with me from the beginning. Marcus just nodded grimly. It was only a matter of time. Alina, ever the strategist, was more direct. "Don't let them guilt you, Sarah. This is a business situation they created. Handle it that way." Her advice was sound, but I knew it would be more complicated than that. These weren't just failed business rivals. They were the architects of my past, the ghosts at my table. At 2:55 p.m., my assistant buzzed my intercom. "Ms. Miller, your father and brother are here." I took a deep breath, straightened the jacket of my suit, and walked out to my office door to greet them myself. It was time to face the consequences of my victory. The moment they walked into the lobby of Apex Hardware, the power dynamic was laid bare. My father, Arthur Miller, once a giant in my eyes, seemed diminished by the high ceilings and the bright, modern space. His suit was dated, his shoulders slumped. He looked around at the bustling activity, at the employees moving with a purpose he no longer commanded, and a flicker of deep, profound loss crossed his face. Kevin trailed behind him, his usual arrogance replaced by a sullen, resentful silence. He refused to meet my eyes, focusing instead on a scuff mark on his expensive but poorly maintained shoes. He was a princess. Tripped of his kingdom, left with nothing but a worthless title. I led them back to my office, the same office from which I had watched their slow-motion collapse. I gestured for them to sit in the chairs opposite my desk, the very same chairs where I had signed the deals that had sealed their fate. The silence in the room was a heavy, suffocating blanket. My father stared at a framed photo on my wall, the Entrepreneur of the Year award. Kevin just stared at the floor. It was my father who finally broke the silence, his voice a hoarse, unfamiliar rasp. "The bank called our loan," he said, the words coming out as if they were stones he was being forced to cough up. "We're insolvent. The suppliers won't extend us any more credit. It's over." He didn't look at me as he spoke. He looked out the window at the sign for his own failed business. There was no blame in his tone, no anger, just the flat, empty sound of defeat. "We have one offer," he continued, "from a national chain. They want to liquidate our assets. They're offering pennies on the dollar for the inventory and the brand name." He finally turned to look at me, and in his eyes I saw something I had never seen before, desperation. "We came to ask if you would be interested in buying us out." Kevin flinched at the words, a sharp, involuntary jerk. The humiliation was radiating from him in palpable waves. This was the ultimate surrender, the final, undeniable admission of his failure. They were asking me to purchase the rubble of the empire I had helped build and then strategically dismantled. I leaned back in my chair, my expression carefully neutral, just as Alina had advised. I thought of the years of sacrifice, of the public humiliation at that family dinner, of the cold, dismissive way he had told me the business needed a man's leadership. I had fantasized about this moment, imagined it would be a rush of triumphant vindication. But sitting here, looking at the broken man who was my father and the resentful shell who was my brother, I felt nothing of the sort. There was no joy, no satisfaction, only a vast, quiet emptiness. I had won. The war was over. And here in the victor's chair, I felt a loneliness so profound it was almost dizzying. "I'll need to see your books," I said, my voice pure business. "Your debt schedule, your inventory logs, your accounts payable. I'll have my financial team conduct a full audit." My father just nodded, a slow, tired movement. "Of course." He stood up, his movements stiff and old. Kevin followed suit, still refusing to look at me. They were turning to leave when I spoke again. "Why?" I asked, the question escaping before I could stop it. "Why did you do it, Dad?" He paused at the door, his back to me. For a long moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. "I thought I was protecting the family name," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was a fool. I valued the name on the sign more than the person who built the business." He walked out without looking back, leaving me alone in the quiet hum of my hard-won victory. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in detached professionalism. I handed over the financial documents from Miller & Son to my CFO, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Jessica. Her only instruction was to evaluate the company as she would any other potential acquisition, coldly and without emotion. "Ignore the name on the paperwork," I told her. "Just give me the unvarnished numbers." While she and her team dove into the red ink, I went about my work. I led meetings, approved budgets, and solved logistical snags. I compartmentalized, building a wall between Sarah Miller, the CEO of Apex Hardware, and Sarah Miller, the daughter who was about to purchase the ruins of her father's life. But the wall was thin. In the quiet moments, driving home, staring at my ceiling in the middle of the night, the enormity of the situation would wash over me. I thought about my father's whispered confession at my office door. Wasn't an apology, not really, but it was an admission of his folly, a crack in the stubborn pride that had defined him my entire life. Late on the second day, Jessica walked into my office and placed a thin binder on my desk. "It's a disaster," she said bluntly. "Worse than we thought. The debt load is crushing. The inventory is a mix of obsolete and low-turnover stock. Their brand reputation is in the gutter. As a going concern, it's worthless." She pointed to a number at the bottom of a page. "Based on the liquidation value of their remaining physical assets, the shelving, the last of the decent inventory, the trucks, minus the outstanding debt, we've arrived at a valuation." The number was shockingly low. It was a pittance, an insult to the 30 years of history the company represented. "The offer from the national chain," Jessica continued, "is actually generous. They're likely overpaying slightly just to eliminate a competitor's brand from the market. From a purely financial standpoint. Sarah, you should let them have it. Walk away." I stared at the number. Walk away. It was the smart move, the logical move. Let some faceless corporation pick over the bones of my family's past. Let the Miller & Son name disappear into a footnote in a quarterly report. I could be free of it, finally and completely. But it didn't feel right. It felt like an abdication, like letting someone else finish the story I had started. This was my history, my legacy, tangled as it was with pain and betrayal. I couldn't just let it be erased. I made my decision. It wasn't about finances, not anymore. It was about control. It was about closing the loop on my own terms. I called my father and asked them to come back the next day. This time, when they sat in the chairs opposite me, I was ready. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It contained my offer. I'm prepared to acquire the total assets of Miller and Son Industries, I stated, my voice devoid of emotion. I will assume all outstanding debt to suppliers to ensure they are made whole. In exchange for the brand, the remaining inventory, and all physical property, I will offer you this. My father picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the figure. It was 20 cents on the dollar of the company's book value from 2 years ago, a brutal, unflinching reflection of how far it had fallen. It was just enough to settle their debts with the bank and leave them with a small, almost insulting fraction of what they once had. Kevin snatched the paper from my father's hand, his face contorted with rage. 20 cents on the dollar? Are you kidding me? This is a joke. It's an insult. It's a business offer, Kevin, I replied calmly. It reflects the current value of a failing company. My team's analysis suggests this is actually more than the assets are worth once the debt is factored in. The alternative is bankruptcy, where you'll get nothing. My father said nothing. He just looked at me, his face pale, his expression unreadable. He saw the cold logic in my offer. He understood that I was not offering a handout. I was offering a clean cut, a way to end the bleeding without total annihilation. I was offering a victor's mercy, and it was as sharp and as cold as a surgeon's knife. "We'll take it," my father said, his voice a dry whisper, ignoring Kevin's sputtering protests. The deal was made. The war was officially over. I had won. The days following the signing of the papers were surreal. I was now the legal owner of the rubble of my past. Lawyers and accountants handled the transition, a sterile process of signatures and wire transfers that belied the emotional weight of the transaction. My father and brother disappeared from view, retreating to lick their wounds in private. My mother sent me a single, terse text message. "I hope this makes you happy." It didn't. The victory I had fought so hard for felt like ash in my mouth. There was no celebration, no triumphant toast with my team. There was only the quiet, heavy finality of it all. 1 week after the deal closed, I did something I hadn't done in years. I used my old key to let myself into the flagship Miller & Sons store. It was late in the evening, long after the last employee had gone home. The power was still on, but the air inside was still and silent, thick with the smell of dust and defeat. It was a ghost ship. The aisles were a chaotic mess of half-empty shelves and discounted products. 70% off signs, hastily written in marker, hung askew. Kevin's last desperate attempt to generate cash flow. I walked through the cavernous space, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. This was where my life had been forged. I remembered stocking these very shelves as a teenager, the satisfying ache in my muscles at the end of a long day. I remembered mapping out the store's expansion in my college notebooks, dreaming of the day I would run it. I remembered standing here with my father, him beaming with pride, after we landed our first major commercial account. I made my way to the back office, the one that had been my father's for 30 years before he handed it to Kevin. It was a time capsule of mismanagement. Piles of unpaid invoices sat on the desk. Angry letters from suppliers were pinned to a corkboard. A whiteboard, covered in Kevin's frantic and nonsensical scrawls, showed a pathetic, last-ditch marketing plan. Tucked away on a bookshelf, behind a dusty trophy, I found an old photo album. I blew the dust off the cover and opened it. The first picture was of me, about 7 years old, wearing a tiny, oversized tool belt and a hard hat that swallowed my head. I was standing in this very store, grinning a gap-toothed smile at the camera. My father was crouched beside me, his arm around my shoulder, his face alight with a love and pride that was so pure and uncomplicated it made my throat ache. We looked happy. We looked like a family. I sank into the dusty office chair, photograph clutched in my hand. What had happened to that little girl? What had happened to that proud father? The answer was complicated, a tangled mess of pride, prejudice, ambition, and betrayal. I had my justice. I had my empire. Apex Hardware was a testament to my skill, my resilience, my worth. I had proven beyond any doubt that I was more than capable. But as I sat alone in the wreckage of my family's legacy, the silence of the empty store pressing in on me, I understood the profound and bittersweet truth of my victory. I had won the war, but in the process, I had lost my home. The name on the sign outside would soon change. The shelves would be restocked, the floors polished, the brand reborn under the Apex banner. But the ghost of that little girl in the oversized hard hat, and the proud father who had once adored her, would linger in the empty aisles forever.